just in case nobody's met him before. And before he gives the actual talk about the Jewish aspects of Operation Mincemeat, you may be aware that 2018 is the 125th anniversary of the Jewish Historical Society of England, and last month throughout the branches in England there were a number of meetings with the theme of Month of Jewish History. While we were busy with Purim and preparing for Pesach, we decided to leave it for a month, and our speaker tonight is going to say a few words about the importance of the Jewish Historical Society.
Definitely a few words.
And just a few words. And then we'll move on to the Operation Mincemeat, which is the main feature this evening. Our speaker, Gabriel Sivan, was born in Liverpool, educated in Oxford, Jews College, and the Hebrew University, where he got his... Can you say that quietly to him afterwards?
No, I need to know because now we went on to university. If they were Jewish.
You must be joking.
Okay, we can exchange notes on that afterwards. He made Aliyah in 1967. He had served as a Russian translator and monitor of Soviet aircraft in the Royal Air Force from 1954 to 1955, and had been vice chairman of IUJF, chairman of the University Zionist Council. He's a cultural historian, a number of books, journals. His CV says that he has contributed over 2,000 articles to major works of reference, including encyclopedias, almanacs, dictionaries, the Oxford Dictionary of the Jewish Religion, and more recently he's published Isaac Goller, Poems, Plays and Prose Works, and also edited our own book, which was published here, The Jewish Emigrant from Britain, which was published in 2013, and he wrote most of the North American chapter for that. He's a member of the International Advisory Board of the South African Quarterly Jewish Affairs, and he's been chairman of this branch for almost 7 years. And his wife, Viva, is a former member of the Jerusalem City Council. They have 4 married children, 16 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren, all living in Israel. Gabriel Sivan.
Right, thank you for that glorious introduction.
I only cut half of it out.
Well, that's it.
Yeah, we want to speak from that side just now when we sort this
Okay.
out.
Yeah.
If you can.
Right, so preliminaries. Before beginning, I'd like to draw your attention, as Kenneth has said, to the fact that this evening marks the 125th anniversary of the Jewish Historical Society of England's establishment in London in 1893.
Microphone, please.
There isn't one.
They had a problem with the microphone. They're grudgingly fixing up the PowerPoint, and muttered and went off when I mentioned microphone.
We're not going to get one at all.
I think it's unlikely.
Well, that will be cause reason for a protest.
You're going to have to speak
Yeah,
loudly and project.
from there. Can I go do it from there now?
Yes, well, it's only when he comes back in to try and connect this computer up.
Oh, I see. All right. Well, let's do this. There are now Jewish Historical Society branches all over the United Kingdom, although, surprisingly enough, the one in Manchester has been inactive.
Yeah.
We are the only overseas branch, and by all accounts, the most active branch outside the capital. Indeed, the Jewish Emigrant from Britain, I usually have a copy here, but there is one floating around. That's a 228-page book, which we published 5 years ago, which is still available, incidentally. it broke new ground in more senses than one. I'm also pleased to welcome Colin Lang. Stand up, Colin. Colin Lang, who is a nephew of the late Judge Israel, popularly known as Shmuel Feinstein, who was a great friend of our society and a specialist in 18th to 19th century Anglo-Jewish history. He served twice as president of the Jewish Historical Society of England, the home branch, and as president of the Board of Deputies and a vice president of the World Jewish Congress. Colin, who is himself a retired judge, as far as I understand, has written a book called Divided We Stand, a journey with Judge Israel Feinstein QC, which appeared last year in the United Kingdom. I'd also like to welcome, much to my surprise, I didn't know he was here, somebody I hadn't seen since about what would it be now? About 1973, 74, as far as I remember. David Olivestone from London, who spent about 40 years in the United States. And he and I were both contributors to the Encyclopedia Judaica. His speciality was Chazanut. And some of you may remember that there was an article of his about the subject of Cantor Gershon Sirota in the Jerusalem Post. Right. I have finished my preliminaries. As soon as I can get to the podium, I will do so. But let me start by asking you a question. How many of you have ever heard of Operation Mincemeat? Oh, very good, about a third of the audience. And does it associate, or is anybody particular associated with it in your minds? Very good, yes. Okay. Let me explain and give the background. The point is this, that a lot of my information derives from a wonderful book called Operation Mincemeat by a man named Bill McIntyre. This is more or less, one could say, the Bible of the subject, because nothing else as detailed, as far as I know, has ever appeared. Although some of the things which I'm going to tell you about come from later sources he didn't know of when the book was written. So let's get down to the subject. I will now give you basically an outline of what it was all about, but stressing from time to time some of the interesting Jewish aspects which crept into it. By May the 13th, 1943, all of the remaining Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. The Allies' next aim was therefore the invasion of Sicily. But since powerful concentrations of German and Italian forces were based there, a way had to be found to persuade the enemy that the Allies would actually launch an attack on Sardinia or Greece, or both at the same time. Winston Churchill, and this
We're in business.
We are, okay, we need illustration number one. Winston Churchill, I'll get to the podium.
I'm going to turn maybe the lights down a little bit so you'll see this more clearly. Gabriel, when you want the next one. Okay. When you want the next slide, you just press this one, this arrow to the right.
Okay.
And you want to go to the left.
But if I want to go out of order, then you have to do it.
All right, okay.
Right, okay. Let's say that. Right. Can I get back to the subject? Winston Churchill declared that anyone but a bloody fool would know that the objective was Sicily, and he encouraged schemes devised by spies with what he called corkscrew lines, because Hitler thought in straight lines. At his meetings with British and American top brass, and here, in my first illustration, I want to identify certain people. Churchill is there at the table. This is Bernard Montgomery, Dwight D. Eisenhower. I think Field Marshal Alexander is there, and that was whoever was in head of the Air Force in the Middle East. Many of the others are probably Americans.
Anthony Eden on the left.
Oh yes, you're right. That's
Anthony Eden.
That's
That's
Anyway, so this was a meeting of Allied leaders, and it was resolved at this meeting that British military intelligence would devise a workable plan, and its starting point was a memorandum written as far back as 1939 by Rear Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, whose personal assistant was one Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, later renowned as the author of James Bond spy thrillers. Now, Fleming had come up with 51 suggestions about how to fool the enemy, of which number 28 was the kind of scheme that Churchill loved. In his view, the conquest of Sicily would punch a hole in what he called the soft underbelly of the Axis and turn the tide against the enemy. Suddenly, Fleming's mad idea, which was to, we'll see in a moment what it was all about, suddenly appeared feasible. And two, Gadaba. Is that over? Hello? Ah, you can hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. The two corkscrew stinkers were Flight Lieutenant Charles Chumley, an astute and rather eccentric RAF pilot who didn't fly, but he joined MI5, and he used to remind everyone that his surname spelled Cholmondeley was pronounced Chumley. And the other was Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague, RNBR, a naval officer who hadn't gone to sea, and he was serving in the Royal Navy's Intelligence Division. Now, I do have two family tree charts. Hold on, I have to go.
That's Montague.
Oh, that's Montague.
And the next one.
Oh, so it'll be the next one. Yeah, okay. That's a picture of you and Montague. I must apologise for the quality of some of these pictures because they've been taken from third-hand sources, and it's not always possible to get better ones. Ah, right. Family tree number 1. This is the family tree of the Montague family. The Montague Samuel family were, I have to say this with a certain amount of old-fashioned pride as a Liverpudlian, they were a Liverpool family originally. And the First Lord Swaithing, Baron Swaithing, was Samuel Montague, who went on to not only to make a lot of money, but also to become the benefactor of the foreign Jews in the East End of London, for whom he founded the Federation of Synagogues. But he was, although he was devoted to Jews and Judaism, he was not devoted to Zionism. And the one thing that his son, the second Baron, took after him was being an anti-Zionist. He was not frum, he was not a sugar, and so forth. Now, Ewan Montague belongs to a branch of the family. His Louis the second Baron, that's what I was talking about, had 3 sons. There was Stuart Albert Samuel, who became the 3rd Baron, and there was Ewan Edward Samuel Montague, who was the one we're talking about, the 2nd son, and the 3rd son we'll come back to later was a certain Ivan Montague, of somewhat infamous memory, but I'll explain why.
Can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Sorry, I wasn't talking into the thing. I said that Ivan Montague was of somewhat dubious, if not infamous, memory because of his political associations. Right. Montagu's family belonged to the Anglo-Jewish cousinhood. Oh, I'll flick some because the next one shows you where the Montagues come in the Samuel family. Which makes them, of course, members of the same family as Lord Samuel, Herbert Samuel, and Nebi Samuel and all their descendants. So there were a lot of children from Louis Eliezer, and so we got two dynasties, the Samuel dynasty and the Montague dynasty. Cholmondeley was secretary of the Inter-Service 20 being spelled Roman fashion XX.
This is Cholmondeley.
Yeah, XX, or double cross. The double cross, you see the point. The double cross committee ran double agents and had devised a Trojan horse scheme which the XX committee at first turned down as impracticable. And even so, the basic idea might be worth exploring. Wartime had transformed Montagu into a bold and ambitious intelligence officer who, it was said, could see inside the minds of his opponents and exploit their weaknesses. He and Cholmondeley were given 3 months to devise and execute a plan before the scheduled invasion of Sicily in July 43. Their elaborate scheme, codenamed Operation Mincemeat, that was one of several terms that were chosen at random, or selected, investigated at random. Because it was so weird, it was also a sort of corkscrew mind type of choice. Anyway, it secured the approval of Churchill and then of Eisenhower, the overall Allied commander in the Mediterranean. Right, so the next thing was, so how do you go about it? Operation Mincemeat reflected, its code name reflects the two planners' distinctly black sense of humour. Its first requirement, and this comes from our friend of the detective series, it required the corpse of a recently deceased nobody that could be transformed into a British officer who had apparently drowned at sea after a plane crash. A briefcase chained to his belt would contain secret documents relating to the planned invasion of Greece and/or Sardinia. A suitable cadaver was eventually found, that of a 34-year-old Welsh tramp named Glyndwr Michael, who had apparently committed suicide by swallowing rat poison. I'm going to get a quotation now. A single man, illegitimate and probably illiterate, without money, friends or family, he had died unloved and unlamented, but not unnoticed. Refrigerated in St Pancras mortuary, Glyndwr was given a bogus ID and outfitted as Captain Acting Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. We're going to get to pictures 7 to 8. That's Montagu, we'll come back to that. There we are. That's the man who was to become the hero of the story. Let me just see if there was something. Oh, there we go, yeah. And there's a fake ID. Now, the picture was based on that of a real soldier, a real officer. What happened was that Montagu spent ages looking for somebody in London crowds, somebody who might look anything like the rather, by this time, distorted visage of Glyndwr Michael. And eventually he found somebody who was almost his spitting image. They took his photograph, and that went into the ID. Right. By the way, this acting major was supposed to be an expert on landing craft. That will come into it. His briefcase would contain a fake letter referring to invasion plans from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Sir Harold Alexander, Commander of the 18th Army Group in North Africa, together with a covering letter from Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten Chief of Combined Operations, to Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Andrew Cunningham. And that's the letter. You won't be able to read it very easily. But what it says is, in fact, is a lot of blah about this chap that I'm sending the letters to you with. And he's very dependable and he's okay, blah, blah, blah. And Mountbatten signed this. Now, the interesting thing is that the other letter by Nye, they tried to concoct all kinds of texts, and none of them were satisfactory, until in the end somebody said, well, would you like to do it? And he wrote the letter, which was much better than any of the others, which was put into the briefcase in a sealed envelope. In addition to these secret dispatches, so-called, Major Martin would have an invented private life, revealed by what they called wallet litter and items in his pockets, such as letters from his father, love letters from a non-existent girlfriend named Pam, a demand note from his bank manager who said, "Dear sir, unless," theatre ticket stubs, and a receipt for a diamond engagement ring costing £53, 10 shillings and sixpence. A genuine receipt, by the way, which, according to the experts, would be equivalent to about £13,000 today. But it was never actually purchased. All of these items were designed to make his identity and mission thoroughly convincing, and Britain's diplomatic officials in Spain were given advance warning of the scheme, of course. This briefcase strategy may have derived its inspiration from the haversack ruse, which was contrived by a certain Major Richard Meinertzhagen, General Allenby's pro-Zionist intelligence chief in 1917, a hoax that helped the enemy forces in Turkish-ruled Palestine to be defeated. Now, Cholmondeley and Montagu were so involved in this business and invented identity, they more or less fell in love with their creation. But Montagu was the one who went to the greatest extreme, starting to live the part of Major Martin himself, and cajoling a certain attractive MI5 secretary named Jean Leslie into signing one of her photos as Pam, which he had placed on his dressing table. Ewan Montagu, as I hinted before, was a nephew of the infamous Edwin Montagu, Britain's anti-Zionist Secretary of State for India, who had endeavoured to sabotage the Balfour Declaration. Incidentally, those of you who have been to past meetings will have heard all about him before. Well aware that in the event of a German invasion, he would figure on the Gestapo's blacklist, Ewan and his wife Iris, daughter of the eminent Jewish painter Solomon J. Solomon, and their two children, evacuated to the United States at the beginning of the war. His mother, Lady Gladys Swadeling, happened to see an enlarged photo of Pam on Ewan's dressing table, and not convinced by his explanation, started to drop hints to her in her letters to her daughter-in-law overseas that she and her youngsters had better come home in a hurry. But in all probability, the affair was just make-believe. Right, now we talk about Major Martin going to war. As the Allies had feared, German troops were being reinforced in Sicily at this time. It meant that a key item in the dead man's briefcase, General Nye's letter, had to convince the Nazis that Greece, and not Sicily, was the Allied objective, and that Major Martin was a special courier who had drowned after the aircraft carrying him was shot down and crashed into the sea. A single eyelash was placed in the folded letter. If it was missing when the Spanish authorities returned the briefcase, it would be clear that German spies had seen and read the contents. By the way, in case I didn't mention it earlier, the idea was that the body would be floated ashore on the coast of Spain. Now, to prevent its rapid decomposition, Montagu and Cholmondeley had the body packed with dry ice and placed in a specially designed steel canister bearing the label optical instruments. They then accompanied it in the back of a van, driven north at top speed on a 500-mile bumpy journey to a rendezvous off the west coast of Scotland. Lieutenant Bill Jewell, sorry, there's a mistake in the text, never mind. The skipper of the submarine Seraph was a certain Bill Jewell, and he was waiting for them when they arrived at Holy Loch and finally departed with the body on the 19th of April 1943. And they proceeded underwater. Oh yes, here's a map. Can you see on the main map? Maybe I'll just point out the highlights. The numbered order is as follows. Number 1, I think it should be there. Hold on, where's number 1? Number 1 should be where our friend was born in South Wales.
Yeah.
Number 2 would then be, not see this so clearly.
So he's in London.
Yeah, right, yeah. That's when that's after. The body was, he died in London, and that's when it was. Then the body's taken to Holyloch in Scotland, and then there's a submarine journey all the way to the Bay of Biscay to this point of the coast, southwest coast of Spain, very close to Portugal. Right. The final journey is from there to Madrid, and from Madrid to Berlin. But that comes later. That comes later. Right. Seraph departed from Holy Loch on the 19th of April and proceeded underwater for a carefully chosen spot near Huelva. That's a small port on the southwest coast of Spain. That had been chosen because of the tides. They knew that if a body was placed in the sea there at a certain time, that the tide would take it to the shore instead of washing it out. There, after appropriate readings from the Psalms, it's actually Tehillim 39:2-3, Major Martin was removed from the canister and lowered into the sea to be washed ashore at Punta Umbria on the 30th of April. In other words, the journey taken 11 days. The body was soon discovered by a fisherman who reported its arrival to the local authorities. Now that should be 10. Right, we'll come to this gentleman. As luck would have it, a naval lieutenant and military judge was the first official to arrive and inspect the body of Major Martin. His offer to hand the unopened briefcase to Britain's vice-consul in Huelva, Francis Hazelden, reflected a pro-British attitude in Spain's navy. That was unusual because almost all of the Spanish military authorities were fascist and pro-German. But in the navy, for some reason, they had a pro-British tradition. Unfortunately, Hazelden knew only too well that a positive response to this offer of the body, and the briefcase rather, would thwart Operation Mincemeat's plan to hoodwink the German Abwehr, the counterintelligence of the German High Command, who were operating on supposedly neutral soil. So Hazelden ventured to suggest that it might be more in line with protocol for the lieutenant's superiors to examine the briefcase before it was returned to him. The whole idea was that would give the Germans an opportunity to get it from the Spaniards. The naval officer agreed and departed with the briefcase. Now, intriguingly enough, 450 years after the expulsion from Spain, that helpful Spanish lieutenant's name was Mariano Pascual de Pobil Ben Suzan, believe it or not. What Christians normally would have a name like Ben Suzan? Thanks to prior instructions from London, the vice-consul was also aware of another danger. The Spanish pathologists conducting a post-mortem might undertake a thorough examination of the dead man's body and concluded that it had spent a good deal of time refrigerated in a mortuary rather than a week or two floating out at sea. So Hazelden therefore suggested that the cause of death must be obvious to the pathologists, who had to endure terrible stench emanating from the corpse, and they might find it advisable to bring the post-mortem to a speedy conclusion. This proposal was accepted. A death certificate was issued, and arrangements were made for Major Martin to be interred without further delay. There had been no one to mourn Glyndwr Michael's death in London, but in Welver he was buried with full military honours on the 2nd of May 1943. Ewan Montagu had already identified the senior Abwehr agent at Welver, a certain Adolf Klaus, who would unknowingly play a part in the 20 Committee's scheme. Klaus, who was known as the Shadow, collected butterflies as well as information and was thought to be the most efficient German agent in Phalangist Spain. But Montagu considered him unimaginative and tailor-made to be duped. News of the so-called drowned British officer quickly reached Klaus, who tried to gain access to the mysterious briefcase. This was a move that Montagu and Chumley had anticipated. They dispatched a series of urgent and easily decoded telegrams to British diplomats and agents in Spain, asking what had happened to certain vital documents in the briefcase, and warning that they should on no account fall into undesirable hands. Klaus believed that cooperative local officials, especially the pro-German police, would grant his request, and he was taken aback when it reached and was ignored by the Spanish naval authorities. Room 103 in London, which is where Montagu and company worked under the Admiralty, Room 103 was also startled, having hoped that the fake letters would swiftly fall into the hands of the Abwehr. The briefcase remained intact and was dispatched by way of Cadiz to Madrid, where it was locked away for the time being in a Spanish Admiralty safe. On the 8th of May 1943, a pro-Nazi army officer, Spanish army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ramon Pardo Suarez, was authorized to remove important briefcase correspondence from the Admiralty safe, carefully extracting the letters from their envelopes, photographing the contents, and then replacing them without tampering with the official seals. Now, I can't go into the whole technicality how it was done. It involved twisting the envelope and inserting a rod and getting the thing wound around the rod and then in and out. Anyway, it was a technique that they had developed. No one noticed that a tiny eyelash had fallen out of the unfolded sheet of notepaper. So, in other words, the British would soon know that the Germans had actually been examining it. The photos were taken to the German embassy in Madrid, where Abwehr agents were given precisely 1 hour to photocopy them before they were returned, supposedly untouched, to the Admiralty safe. 3 days later, on the 11th of May, Admiral Alfonso Arriago Adam, Spain's Chief of Naval Staff, arrived at the British Embassy carrying a black briefcase and a buff envelope in order to return all the effects and papers found on the dead officer's body. Quote, "They are all there," he told Captain Alan Hilgarth, the British naval attaché, with a knowing look. The Admiral obviously knew what was contained in the briefcase and the pockets of the deceased, but this did not prove that German agents had seen and believed them. Only later would a forensic examination in Britain show that the fake documents had been read by the Nazis, who, as British codebreakers discovered, regarded them as authentic, but that came later. Now, Operation Mincemeat enters a crucial stage. Would it succeed in outwitting the Nazis? Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, a distant relative and protege of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German High Command's counterintelligence, what we've been calling all the time the Abwehr, was the leading Abwehr operative in Madrid and Hitler's most trusted agent in Spain. This son of a general, a dandyish tennis-playing chap, was to all outward appearance as a successful businessman, which was his cover for running a network of spies and informers. No, it's not there yet. That's later. That's at the end. Yeah. Spies and informers over Spain. and farther afield. He was determined to succeed where Klaus had failed. But the Abwehr's golden boy was in reality, quote, a one-man disaster area who had already fallen victim to an elaborate British hoax, which involved a bogus Nazi agent who continually supplied Kuhlendahl with fake information from sources that he had cheerfully invented himself. This went right almost to the end of the war, this was going on. MI5 had a thick dossier on Kuhlendahl, and messages to and from the German spy master were regularly intercepted by codebreakers at Bletchley Park. For Operation Mincemeat to succeed, the Germans must be made to believe that they had gained access to the documents undetected. They should then assume that British intelligence believed the Spaniards had returned the documents unopened and unread. Operation Mincemeat would only work if the Germans could be fooled into believing that the British had been fooled. Since all of this required careful stage management, various precautionary measures were necessary. They included a series of increasingly anxious diplomatic inquiries about the whereabouts of the vital documents sent via permeable channels of communication. And the death of Major Martin announced in the Globe and Laurel, the official newsletter of the Royal Marines. His name was also listed on a Roll of Honour published in the 4th June 1943 issue of the London Times. By pure chance, the names of 2 other naval officers whose death in an aircraft accident had previously been reported in the newspaper appeared on the same list. The Germans, Montagu speculated, might link the reported death of Martin with that incident. The death of Leslie Howard, a distinguished film and stage actor, was reported in a news story alongside the Roll of Honour. The civilian plane carrying the actor had been shot down by a German fighter over the Bay of Biscay. Somewhat eerily, an Abwehr informant may have mistaken Howard for Winston Churchill, who had recently visited Algiers and Tunis. Leslie Howard, the quintessential upper-class Englishman, was of Hungarian and German Jewish descent. An outspoken anti-Nazi, he had worked devotedly in support of the British war effort. How many of you knew that Leslie Howard was a Jew? His son Ronald Howard was also a film star. After perusing the secret letters, Kuhlendahl believed that they provided him with the greatest intelligence feat of his career. Bletchley Park decrypted a message indicating that he had left hurriedly for Berlin on the 9th of May to present his Abwehr bosses with vital information. But somehow, Montagu and Chambly were left completely in the dark, so British intelligence wasn't always so intelligent. From Abwehr headquarters, where Kuhlendahl had received warm congratulations, the photostats were sent for authentication to the German High Command's Western Intelligence FHW unit, headed by Lieutenant Colonel Alexis Baron von Röhner. He's the man in the picture there. A bespectacled Latvian-born aristocrat who enjoyed an almost mystical reputation for divining and predicting Allied intentions. That was true. He had expected that in 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland, that the Allies would make a lot of progress and do nothing. And the same goes for other things that happened. He saw in advance what the Allies would do with the enemy and so forth. Only up to a certain point. As Ewan Montagu had foreseen, the FHW would obtain a complete inventory and description of every item in the briefcase and the wallet and the pockets of Major Martin, treating the dead man's arrival with caution and scrutinizing each phrase in the key letters before submitting their report. Von Röhner's unhesitating conclusion was A, that the drowned British officer, his mission and all his equipment were genuine, and B, that the Allied target was not Sicily, but Greece, where the Germans still had 2 or 3 weeks to strengthen their forces before they were attacked. He also suggested that the High Command might dupe the Allies with a deception plan of its own by pretending to reinforce German troops in Sicily while doing nothing of the sort. For Adolf Hitler, this was a most welcome report. Vast numbers of his fighting men on the battlefields of North Africa and the Russian front had been killed, badly wounded or captured, while Allied bomber fleets were tearing German cities and industry to shreds. Losses at sea were also mounting, as Bletchley Park codebreakers pinpointed the U-boat wolf packs. Hitler lost faith in his generals, needed to hear some good news. Only Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels half suspected an elaborate British hoax, but he kept his doubts to himself. If the Führer believed that the letters were authentic, that was all that mattered. On the 12th of May, the day on which Captain Hilgarth in Madrid had sent London a telegram confirming the safe return of a briefcase, Montagu was leafing through the latest Bletchley Park dispatches when he gave a loud whoop and banged the table so hard his coffee cup flew onto the floor. The code breakers had intercepted a top-secret wireless message from General Alfred Jodl, the Wehrmacht's chief of operations, warning senior German Army, Navy and Air Force commanders that information had been received from an absolutely reliable source, that they should prepare for a large-scale Allied attack on Greece and perhaps on Sardinia. As a result, 90,000 German troops, as well as tanks and aircraft, were rushed from Sicily to the supposedly endangered areas. The Major Martin hoax concocted by Montagu and Chumley had succeeded, and a joyful telegram sent to Winston Churchill read, "Mincemeat swallowed, rot, lineman, sinker." On the 10th of July, 3,000 ships carrying 160,000 British and American troops, 600 tanks, 800 artillery pieces were landed in Sicily, and they completed its occupation in just 38 days. Codenamed Operation Husky, it was the largest amphibious invasion that the world had ever seen. When reports of its further success arrived, a loud cheer erupted from room 13, and Chumley performed a shuffling dance. For Ewan Montagu, a special pleasure lay in the subsequent discovery that Hitler himself had been taken in by the phony documents. "Joy of joys to anyone, and particularly a Jew," he wrote, "the satisfaction of knowing that they had directly and specifically fooled that monster." It also transpired that Operation Mincemeat had been gratifyingly economical. Quote, "One specially made canister, one battle dress uniform, some dry ice, the time of a few officers, a van driven to Scotland and back, about 60 miles added to HMS Seraph's passage, and a few sundries, costing about £200 at most." Some questions remain to be asked. Why, for example, did Baron Alexis von Rünner, a highly experienced intelligence officer, declare the secret letters to be genuine without subjecting them to a more painstaking investigation? The answer could be that this old-fashioned monarchist, a Baltic German who would be regarded in Nazi circles as a Volksdeutsch, he led a double life. As Hitler's favourite and reliable intelligence analyst, and as a secret anti-Nazi with a Christian conscience who was outraged by Nazi atrocities in Eastern Europe. He loathed the Führer, did his best to undermine the German war effort by regularly conveying false information to Hitler's desk, knowing it to be bogus. His finest hour came prior to D-Day in 1944, when he unquestioningly passed on every deception ruse fed to him by the Allies, inflating estimates of their troop strength in Britain and convincing both Hitler and the High Command that the main attack would be launched not on the shores of Normandy, but at Calais. Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal also had reasons of his own for wishing the documents to be to be accepted as genuine. MI5 surveillance files revealed a family secret that he was desperate to conceal. His maternal grandmother was Jewish, rendering him a first-degree non-Aryan according to Nazi race laws, and incidentally, a Jew according to Halakha. This made him paranoid, constantly afraid that Nazis would discover the truth, in which case even Admiral Canaris would be unable to save him, and the members of his family. It also explains Kuhlenthal's anxiety to please his superiors by impressing them with his school. Now we come to the aftermath. Any allegation that Baron Alexis von Röner was working to undermine Hitler and the Nazi regime would have been unthinkable in 1943. Though not directly involved in the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, von Röner was a close friend of Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who planted the bomb, and he had links with other members of the conspiracy. During the Gestapo reprisals that followed, he was arrested and sentenced to death after a show trial staged by the dreaded Volksgericht, the People's Court. Together, I must mention here that 6 months later, a similar death awaited his boss, Admiral Canaris. Right. Kuhlenthal remained out of harm's way in Spain until 1950, when he and his wife slipped back into West Germany to resume the management of their family's clothing company. I think we've seen that picture before, haven't we? The
Right,
ones
so
here.
there's a Cullentown afterwards, I think.
Oh yeah, that's the picture. This was taken in post-war Germany. Not a very good picture, but it was taken at some thing to do with their business enterprise. Right. They resumed the management of their family's clothing company. He then turned out to be much better buying and selling clothes than buying and selling secrets. And no one ever inquired about his past. On the British side, Charles Chumley's post-war life was rather mysterious. In October 1945, he embarked on a new career, chasing swarms of locusts in the Middle East and Rhodesia, feeding them bran laced with insecticide. He also worked for MI5, received the award of an MBE in 1948, and subsequently used his expertise in deception techniques to combat guerrillas in Malaya. After returning to Britain in 1952, he left MI5, moved to the West Country, chose a wife, and established a business selling agricultural machinery. Until his death, 30 years later, Chumley refused to discuss or accept any credit for his role in Operation Mincemeat. Now, as we all know, the Soviet Union maintained a very effective long-range espionage operation in Britain. The Soviets were kept informed of Operation Mincemeat through a number of key agents, such as Anthony Blunt, an MI5 officer whom the NKVD had recruited in 1934. 2 other members of the Cambridge Five spy ring, who probably supplied additional intelligence about the Sicily deception, were John Cairncross. He was the last of the group, I think, to be exposed. He'd been the head of MI5, who had access to the ultra decrypts at Bletchley Park, and of course Kim Philby, the most notorious Soviet mole, who headed the Iberian subsection of MI5's counterintelligence branch. Ivor Montagu, Ewan's younger brother, was a devoted communist who had first drawn the attention of MI5 way back in 1926. A founder of the English Table Tennis Association, Ivor had interests ranging from cricket, exotic cheese, and films, to work on the editorial board of Labour Monthly and the promotion of Anglo-Soviet friendship. The only member of his family who kept in touch with this red sheep was Ewan, who knew all about Ivor's Russian sympathies but never suspected that his brother actually worked for Soviet military intelligence. However, there is nothing to suggest that he ever allowed details of Operation Mincemeat to fall into Ivor's hands, and presumably British counterintelligence were quite satisfied that nothing had ever of that sort ever happened. Ewan Montagu was awarded an OBE and later a CBE for his wartime achievements. Resuming his law career, he served as Judge Advocate of the Fleet from 1945 to 73 and as Recorder in the County of Hampshire, in which capacities he became notorious for his corrosive humour and often inappropriate remarks from the bench. On one occasion he said something about how these schoolboys should have their pants taken down and give a jolly good beating. Mellowing with age, he also became a more devout Jew and served as president of the United Synagogue from 1954 to 62, which is the time when I met him at Jews College. At the same time, despite British officialdom's objections, Montagu strove to publish his own account of Operation Mincemeat, which after some careful vetting appeared as The Man Who Never Was. That's the DVD there. A very unappealing cover photograph. But anyway, that's the DVD, the film. The Man Who Never Was, published in 1954. A follow-up, Beyond Top Secret Ultra, was published in 1977. Now, The Man Who Never Was, as a book, was a bestseller, and it turned Montagu into a celebrity. And the film rights were purchased by 20th Century Fox. The Anglo-American CinemaScope movie, which preserved the book's title, which is this, that's the movie, was directed by Ronald Neame and released in 1956, and it was a great box office success. It starred the American actor Clifton Webb, who didn't look much like Montagu, as Montagu, who made a cameo appearance not as a naval officer, but as an RAF air marshal, who was questioning the feasibility of the operation. There we are. That's a scene from the film, not very clear. Clifton Webb is on the left. Ewan Montagu on the far right. You can see he's in an RAF uniform. There are a couple of other well-known actors in this. And well, anyway, there's another thing, I think next door to it. Yeah, this I didn't show you in the right place. It was a scene in the film of the body being washed ashore near Huelva. And here you see there's a Spanish naval officer and there's various local people and so forth gathered around the body in its May West and with the briefcase attached. Right. At the same time, despite British officialdom's objections, Montagu strove to publish his own account of Operation Mincemeat, which after some careful vetting appeared as The Man Who Never Was. We've said all this before. Now, about the film itself, Montagu was not disturbed by any of the changes that the film introduced, such as Chumley's replacement by a Royal Naval lieutenant that I don't even, I'm not even sure he ever existed, and the arrival in London of a Nazi-based Irish spy whose task it was to verify the identity of Major Martin by checking things with his bank, by going to meet his girlfriend, and so on and so forth. This was a pure invention in the film. Now, aware that he had only a few more months to live, and anxious to know how history would judge him, Montagu wrote a letter in 1984 to Sir Robert Armstrong, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Cabinet Secretary, asking permission to read the typescript of a government-sponsored book about Operation Mincemeat that was still withheld from the public. Although Armstrong felt that too much had already been said and written about British wartime intelligence, Mrs. Thatcher was touched by Ewan Montagu's plea, which was almost on his deathbed. He died the next year. And she decided to grant his request on certain conditions. "I cannot thank you enough," he replied, "for enabling me to read Professor Michael Howard's book before it is too late for me to do so." Hugh Trevor Roper, the eminent British historian, called Operation Mincemeat the most successful hoax in the history of military deception. It saved tens of thousands of Allied lives, led to the downfall of Italy's fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Another important result was Hitler's decision to redeploy a vast number of German troops from the Russian front, enabling the Red Army to win the ferocious tank battle at Kursk and then roll on to Berlin. And I can end with this. One tombstone in the Nuestra Señora de la Soledad cemetery at Huelva is different from the rest. It originally conceived a double life, one brief, sad and real, the other a little longer, entirely invented and oddly heroic. Grave number 1886 was taken over by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in 1977 and is now maintained on the United Kingdom's behalf by the local German consulate. In 1997, half a century after Operation Mincemeat, the British government added a carved postscript to the marble slab. You can see it at the bottom. It reads, Glendower Michael served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines.
Well, that's we can't talk about making mincemeat of things, but a very comprehensive account of a fascinating story with a Jewish character at the centre of it. Has anybody got any questions they would like to ask about the story? Or any comments on really what is a fascinating story of military intelligence?
I knew about it because the Reader's Digest published a condensed version.
Of the book? This must be a long time ago.
No, it's
But they waited till after the war.
about 1960.
Right, okay. Okay, well, it looks as if you've informed everybody. So let me just, on everybody's behalf, thank Gabriel for a really very comprehensive account of Operation Mincemeat. It's a fascinating story, and it's one that deserved to be told, and it's been told in a very nice and appropriately illustrated way. So I'd like everybody to accord a vote of thanks. Very interesting. Our next meeting is on May the 14th, when Rabbi Raymond Apple will be giving a talk about historical aspects of Minhag Anglia. And if there's anybody that hasn't yet signed up